My brothers and sisters, what we are looking at today isn't as much another disturbing trend as much as it is an attempt to change the subject. The social justice warriors and intersectional feminists are going into attack mode because they are losing the debate. And what a terrible choice of a beachhead to establish this new battle. The assault is on free speech, since postmodernists soaked in the caustic fumes of identity politics cannot possibly win their illiberal war on free expression. They are attempting to rebrand people that advocate for free speech as, get this, free speech warriors. I guess they've seen the negative effects on actual social justice perverted by those known as social justice warriors and believe they can play the same game. Here's the main problem with this approach. Social justice and free speech are righteous causes. That the obvious needs to be stated here is a sign that the regressive left is lost. But the problem is that free speech is tied directly to social justice. Without one, you can hardly have the other. We will see in an article written by David Edward Tabachnik on theconversation.com that he shares a fundamental misunderstanding of the basic issues with his ilk on the illiberal left. Tabachnik shows just how clever he is by enticing us into the article that says, "The strange origins of the free speech warriors." How can we resist? He starts off with a bold statement that is an awkward attempt to reframe the discussion. One, by the creepy rebranding of people who hold free speech dear as warriors, and two, using the Fox News tactic of "many people say," which is code for something I want to legitimately transmit to you, but do not have enough evidence to do so. He says, many free speech warriors today base their position on a proclamation articulated by Oliver Wendell Holmes, the early 20th century United States Supreme Court Justice. Holmes wrote that if there is any principle of the Constitution that more imperatively calls for attachment than any other, it is the principle of free thought. Not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. And I agree with him. To show us how clever he is, Tabachnik goes on to quote from others, including John Stuart Mill, making a lackluster attempt to paint Mills alongside heroes of the Enlightenment such as Voltaire as part of some vanguard of progressivism. The irony is apparently lost on Tabachnik, as he later quotes from Mill on his very anti-progressive stance regarding personal liberty. Not only that, he also reveals to us that he is well aware of the serious breach of personal liberty that a big brother style big government can bring about, one that the SJW strive to attain by stifling free speech through the legal system. Mill argued for a big government approach to situations in which the exercise of liberty might result in harm to others or even to the individual practicing it. In On Liberty, he argues that parents of poor moral fiber may have their children removed from the home, and calls for similar state intervention to stop the harms caused by gamblers, prostitutes, and the drug addicts. Even more broadly, he decides that the uncultivated cannot be competent judges of cultivation. Those who most need to be made wiser and better usually desire it least, and if they desire it, would be incapable of finding the way to it by their own lights. In other words, the ignorant and immoral must not have unhindered freedom, as they lack the judgment to exercise it responsibly. This reflects the current desire of the SJW to stifle expression they disapprove of by using dubious moral standards. For example, the now well-known cry from the authoritarian left that words are violence. Further reading shows that he is no stranger to the use of informal fallacy. He states, today's free speech warrior argues that all speech, no matter how offensive or immoral, should be protected from any kind of regulation or persecution. Individuals who make the most hateful statements must be allowed to speak, or we endanger the right and capacity of everyone else to properly express their ideas, whether they are controversial or not. Not only is he strawmanning those he derides, but he should be well aware that the people he attacks acknowledge the limits of free speech, such as inciting violence, libel, and shouting fire in a crowded theater, being probably the most recognized of the many legitimate times where free speech should indeed not be protected. I don't want to appear obtuse, so I do recognize that he did say immoral or offensive, although I tend to believe that his intentions were to smear them as absolutists that believe no speech of any kind should be abridged or sanctioned. Enlightened Western democracies are replete with examples of self-appointed morality police who, in the name of their deeply held convictions, attempted to, and sometimes successfully, legislate their morality. Tabachnik's favorite whipping boy, Professor Jordan Peterson, warns us of the obvious dangers of political correctness and who gets to decide what is immoral or offensive. He warns that sometimes the people who are very opposed to your set of values may very well be the ones deciding what is proper speech and what you cannot say. He continues with an odd subject name for the next set of paragraph: Logic of Free Speech Warriors. He lists this band of merry men and one woman: Gad Saad, Jordan Peterson, Lindsay Shepard, the free speech absolutist contingent from the Great White North, and also includes their U.S. counterparts Ben Shapiro and Dave Rubin. That's all. He could have listed more. They explain their advocacy as a way to counter the well-publicized and growing crisis of political correctness censorship, particularly on North American university campuses. Now, my friend, you are making sense. Although this crisis is not growing, rather, it has grown. But what about that there logic we was waiting to hear about? Notably, while some of the above are cagey about their political leanings, almost all of their efforts are directed toward protecting what might be considered conservative viewpoints and ideas. I think the political leanings of the aforementioned are pretty clear. Some, such as the case of Lindsay Shepard, has evolved since her ordeal at Wilfrid Laurier, should come as no surprise to anyone having paid attention to her very public announcements about where she stands on the political stage. Whether speaking out against Bill C-16, which adds gender identity and gender expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act, feminism, the breakdown of the traditional family, and unwavering support for the state of Israel. They always have to throw that one in, don't they? This group can be fairly placed on the right of the political spectrum. I fail to see any logic in this here section labeled as logic. You are merely suggesting that their motives are to protect the interest of conservative viewpoints. I don't believe that to be the case, but it is not an issue of logic. You're accusing them of having an agenda. Like all rights, free speech has limits. Tabachnik is a professor of political science. This would suggest that he has had a decent education. Everyone knows, and most accept, that there are obvious limits to free speech, as mentioned earlier. He writes, "This is similar to the ideas that back Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 1 describes the protected rights and freedoms of citizens as subject to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society." Well, I must admit that curiosity got the best of me, and I had to check out what Canada has to say about their Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They are very basic and manifest to a free society. They tell us that everyone has the following fundamental freedoms: A, freedom of conscience and religion; B, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication; C, freedom of peaceful assembly; and D, freedom of association. That's pretty much what I expected to read. So go on, tell us more about how cool it is to restrict freedoms, Mr. Tabachnik. This limitations clause permits such things as hate propaganda legislation that makes certain kinds of speech illegal. Well, blow me. I'm going to have to read up on the limitations clause now. Hate propaganda. Advocating genocide. Definition of genocide. 2. In this section, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or part any identifiable group, namely A, killing members of the group; B, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. So it seems that hate propaganda is basically advocating genocide or conditions that would lead to the same. I think that's a sensible law. We can be quite certain that our proud band of free speech absolutists can rally behind it also. But there is more, and here it gets a little bit sticky. Public incitement of hatred. Everyone who, by communicating statements in any public place, incites hatred against any identifiable group where such incitement is likely to lead to a breach of peace is guilty of. Everyone who, by communicating statements other than in private conversation, willfully promotes hatred against any identifiable group is guilty of. The second one is more of a gray area than the first one. Incitement that leads to breach of the peace is one thing. Promoting hatred is rather slippery. But here, the genius of the Canadian system of laws comes in to make things a bit too fuzzy for the intersectional feminists out there. No person shall be convicted of an offense under subsection if he establishes that the statements communicated were true, if in good faith the person expressed or attempted to establish by any argument an opinion on a religious subject or an opinion based on a belief in a religious text. I'm quite certain this carve-out was created for the sole benefit of our Muslim friends up north. But I could be wrong. Either way, it can be used or exploited by anyone. If the statements were relevant to any subject of public interest, the discussion of which was for the public benefit, and if on reasonable grounds he believed them to be true. Well, these exceptions probably make the SJWs want to cry. How are you going to lock up everyone who disagrees with you if there are gaping holes in your hate speech laws? One of the favorite whipping boys of the free speech warrior crowd, German-American philosopher Herbert Marcuse, would likely cast their advocacy as repressive tolerance, a sort of tolerance that strengthens the tyranny of the majority against which authentic liberals protested. That's pretty rich of you to say this. Margaret Wente, writing for the Globe and Mail on why campuses are ditching free speech, mentions your poor besmirched fellow travelers. The flight from free speech is no accident. In fact, it is rooted in the ideas that have spread like invasive weeds and strangled most of the liberal arts. These ideas were advanced by Herbert Marcuse, Theodore Adorno, and other Marxist intellectuals who argued that Western civilization must be overthrown because it allows systematic inequality to persist. Mr. Marcuse's essay on repressive tolerance argues that intolerance towards privileged group is perfectly acceptable to achieve a tolerant and fair society. In other words, our duty is to oppress the oppressors. It follows that free speech, far from being the bedrock of a fair and just society, is illegitimate and even dangerous when the oppressive class uses it to hold onto power. The student group that protested Professor Peterson's appearance at McMaster made this point explicitly. Freedom of speech was not conceived as a mean to protect normative ideas from contestation by marginalized communities, it said. In other words, the overclass has no right to speak. Only their victims do. So we get to the nub of the matter here. Professor Tabachnik, do you find these concepts to be in line with liberalism? It seems that you might have some sympathy for them at any rate. By this measure, their unflinching support for people to express sexist, racist, homophobic, and anti-trans opinions is actually a guise to maintain or return to a more conservative society where women are primarily mothers and wives, immigration is rolled back, same-sex marriage is prohibited, and legislation like Bill C-16 is withdrawn. I don't believe for a minute that any of the pictures you put up on your dartboard are seriously calling for hate speech. Rather, they are calling for freedoms that can and should be inalienable rights for people left, right, and center. Something the crowd you run around with is against. The writer of the opinion piece on The Conversation does not seem terribly interested in a society governed by liberal principles. By joining the chorus of the anti-free speech, anti-free expression, illiberal left, making clumsy attacks against those who would fight to preserve your comfy little freedoms, is taking part in a deadly game of who gets to decide, and I for one do not want those on the extreme right to be the ones that do. But every day I am even more convinced that the extreme left is just as dangerous to our personal freedoms. Goodbye.